Hello there and welcome to the guest segment right here on Africa Business Radio. Now, around the world, major economies, major corporations fined millions of dollars due to non-compliance with regional data protection laws. And that's why on our guest segment today, we'll be talking personal data protection compliance. And I've got with me Andre Adendorf. He's the Director of Pre-Sales at SAP Africa. Good morning, Andre. Thank you so much for making it here this morning.
Good morning. How are you?
All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, so far, GDPR has been considered one of the most stringent rules or regulations so far. Now we have India's PDPB. That one is set to take the benchmark to a whole different level and make it one of the world's most extensive data protection policies. But just for background now, to start off the conversation, can you shed more light on the general data protection regulation?
So GDPR as it stands came into effect in 2018 in Europe, and generally protects personal data and the use and how it's being sort of handled from a European perspective. Since then, we saw a number of regulations around Personal Information Act, or PIA, as we know it. But generally, it refers to compliance, right, worldwide. Depending on the region and the country-specific regulation, there will be differences. Some would be in terminology, others would be sort of an infringement of regulations and so forth. But it deals with the processing, the openness, potentially the security, data subject participation, as we refer to it here in South Africa, and how we sort of make sure that the data is stored and handled correctly. And these principles are essentially derivatives of GDPR.
All right. Okay, so now, when I was going through, the whole data compliance and all that, I also came by the Personal Information Act. How is the GDPR different from the Protection of Personal Information Act?
Yeah, so the good news is that GDPR and Personal Information Act are simply different flavors of data protection laws. They use slightly different terminology, as we say, but to be on the safe side, one should refer to GDPR as it covers slightly more areas than other regulations. So that one can look at as the grandfather of personal data protection in international terms.
All right, that makes sense. Now, when I talked about this earlier in my introduction, I had mentioned that a lot of corporations, especially in 2021, a lot of companies have been attacked. Tech companies, particularly, I must say, have been attacked. They've been fined several times, based on non-compliance to data regulations, right? So, what rules should businesses follow to ensure compliance?
So I think from the start, this was overwhelming to companies, and companies often feel, data protection is a threat. People aren't quite sure as to how to tackle this thing, where in fact it's not. It's a case of starting this off as a company-wide initiative. There are certain guidelines that, call it, experts can advise you on. But it's a program that needs to be implemented, and there's a number of sort of steps that one undertakes. But generally speaking, it would be a case of implementing these guidelines, making sure we've identified the right people in the organization to perform certain roles. So in South Africa, for example, we refer to information officers, data subjects, and so forth. So depending on the regulation and how it's been determined in any different region or country, there would be definite steps in terms of becoming compliant. Obviously starting by registering the company under the specific required regulation.
So correct me if I'm... please go on.
Yeah, and then I think lastly, if once you've undertaken that journey, it's making sure that it gets frequently revised. We make sure that there's a fair amount of training of staff inside the organisation, and that it becomes a everyday activity essentially in the organisation.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong here. I mean, it's been almost maybe already 3 years since the GDPR is entering into application, right? What improvement has it brought, so far? And while you take us through those improvements, has it, just take us through the improvements first, really.
Right. So I think as far as regulations go, the compliance and the benefit ultimately at the end of the day makes sure that the company is a lot less exposed to risk, all right, or subject to any kind of penalty. Also, when it comes to being able to report on the usage of data, systematically, a lot of applications allows one to do this in a very structured manner. Therefore, reducing manpower to scramble around and find who accessed personal data, how it's been used, has it been properly blocked or hidden away from certain people or departments inside the organization. And then lastly, are people able to request the status of how the personal data is being used and also request that that data be erased? Put all of these things together, you'll find that there's efficiency in those processes. And obviously you'll need systems and guidelines ensuring that these processes are complied with.
But then again, there are talks about how the GDPR's technologically neutral and future-proof approach was part of the test during the COVID-19 pandemic and how it somehow facilitated, our move through that period. How so? How did it contribute to that?
Yeah, so again, all of these regulations across the world, these are guidelines in terms of compliance, and then compliance will get checked and tested. So it's important to understand that should any kind of data breach occur, right? Of course, depending on the regulation itself, there are many different systems out there. But having considered taking a neutral approach, also here in South Africa with the Papaya Act, it's a case of saying, okay, well, we're able to control the data, right, regardless of system. Now, the important thing here is one gets structured systems such as ERP or HR systems, or one gets unstructured systems such as emails, which could make it a little bit more difficult. But either way, the guidelines and the steps and compliance should guide you through those. And of course, when it comes to sort of looking at it from a risk-based but yet neutral perspective, these regulations fully appreciate the magnitude of IT systems out there. So, for example, for us, being in the ERP space, we're working on structured systems, which have been thought out globally on a global scale already a couple of years ago when GDPR was first introduced. And of course, that makes it a lot easier for companies to adopt certain processes and handling personal data, as well as the journey to compliance.
Right. Well, here in Nigeria, we've got the NDPR. It was implemented and applied on the 25th of January 2019. It regulates those who have access to data and those who have control of people's data. But then how far-reaching is the GDPR based on geography?
So GDPR refers to processing of data within Europe, okay? But it's not limited necessarily to the borders of Europe. So requests can be made from outside. And again, each regulation will determine sort of the extent as to how personal data should be handled and processed across borders and across countries. And I'd say for Nigeria, I'm not fully aware, of course, what those specifics are, but one would refer to the specifics in those regulations to compare against things like GDPR or other acts in other countries.
All right. Let's move our conversation now to the SAP Business One project. What inspired that project? Tell us about it.
So SAP, of course, being Europe-based, they're a global company. They offer many localizations across the world, and they, of course, align themselves with changes in regulations. GDPR, again, was the first one coming about, and of course, SAP ensured compliance that the software allows for certain processes around personal data controlling and handling. The way that it kind of works in the system is quite easy. It's got a discovery phase for identifying natural persons and thereafter personal data of those persons. But then it allows you to decide what to do with that data. So there are a couple of tools, for example, to make personal data invisible based on certain rules, make it visible again, and then ultimately deciding how long we would like to retain that data inside the system. So depending on the regulation and things like retention periods, these are all options available to companies to control the use of personal data. And it's made a simple process, and greatly because it's a very structured kind of system. And again, because all of these regulations across the world are sort of the derivatives of GDPR, it's got that effect across the globe that one can apply the same principles in the application. For us, as State of Africa, as the POPI Act only came into effect now in July, we've had a lot of interest in our existing base to enable this kind of support in terms of personal data protection. And again, it's a journey that companies go through in getting through to that compliance. Of course, things like a lot of training also go hand in hand with it. And I'd say also that for SAP globally, they are the thought leaders when it comes to applications and back office systems, making sure that they're ahead of the pack.
All right, just to wrap this up now, Andre, I'd like to understand how SAP Business One, in compliance with POPIA, that's the Protection of Personal Information Act, how they both make things easier for organizations. So
it's a function that gets deployed, right? And together with assigning certain roles and of people, assigning them to compliance roles, these staff then start using the system to perform these certain processes. As we mentioned, as we spoke about identifying natural persons, their data, how to use it, and so forth. So for companies already running SAP, super easy. For companies embarking on a journey in terms of looking at ERPs, definitely a benefit in the long term. And by having complied or registered in terms of compliance and making sure that you work through your various systems inside the organization, ERP, SAP Business One being one of them, and identifying certain aspects of these applications, those processes then will come to light and start being used effectively.
Well, that makes sense. Thank you so much, Andre. We'll have to wrap this up at this point. Thank you for giving us your insight into that. And great piece on data protection. I do hope that you'll be available for further conversations around this.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you.
You too. Bye. And that was Andre Adendorf. He's the director at Pre-Sales, SAP Africa. Stay here.